Welcome to those of you who are in the room here at the UnHerd Club in London. If you are watching online, welcome to you as well. Yes, this evening we are live streaming on both YouTube and X. So if you're catching that, we're really pleased. We don't normally do that, so it adds a certain jeopardy to the occasion. That means if we say something heinous, we will get in trouble for it, but this is a free speech club, so feel free to say whatever you like. We will not mind. The purpose of today's event, obviously, despite the grand title, we cannot conduct an entire alternative COVID inquiry in the hour that we have allotted ourselves. But it just feels like the official COVID inquiry here in the UK was so narrowly defined, almost deliberately so, to avoid the difficult questions and avoid finding answers that would be embarrassing to the vast majority. And we are actually approaching something of an anniversary. And by way of introduction to my panel, I'm actually going to read a little extract. This is a chapter of a book called The Wager, and it begins like this. Should I tell you what I really think? Please. On 16th of April, Johan Giesecke was seated in front of a traditional Swedish tile stove on his estate outside Södertälje, south of Stockholm. The spring light filtered through the window. Every now and then, he looked out through its panes at the glassy lake where he went swimming every morning, immersed in thought. No, that is not the beginning of Girl with a Dragon Tattoo or a Swedish noir. This is actually a chapter from Johan Anderberg's brilliant best-selling book, The Herd, which details the history of the COVID pandemic, and that is actually the chapter about my interview with him. So this was almost exactly 4 years ago today, in April 2020, and that amazing interview that some of you may have caught, we certainly weren't expecting it. Suddenly, you know, it was 1 month into those lockdowns, that unbelievably surreal time, and no one knew what to make of it. Everyone was sort of tiptoeing around. The messages from the television screens blaring at us were all sort of just telling us to stay calm and, you know, not ask any questions. And suddenly, this gruff Swedish 60-something-year-old who clearly had not got the memo, just completely dismissed all of the shibboleths of the lockdown area. He said there was no evidence for them. He wasn't especially worried about the virus. Had he been in charge, he would have gone completely a different direction. And this is coming from someone who had advised the World Health Organization, was the kind of ranking epidemiologist in Sweden, had trained the current head. And it really took off, and it really changed the global conversation, I think, around that. It made it legitimate to question, and it became famously a political and very heated conversation. About 1 month after that, we lured Professor Sunetra Gupta, also one of the world's most eminent epidemiologists from the University of Oxford, to do another interview with us. Which also, I would say, moved you from being an esteemed academic into at the centre of some kind of political controversy that is still, I would say, around. You're definitely the most famous member of the zoology department in the history of Oxford. And she, of course, went on to co-write the Great Barrington Declaration later that year, and has been at the centre of this. And so welcome, Sunetra, really great to see you. And for those of you who do not know, sitting over there is Thomas Fazi, an UnHerd columnist and a writer in his own right, who has also written a book about COVID called The Covid Consensus, which he co-wrote with Toby Green, which is a fascinating read, and I would highly recommend.
Thank you.
So welcome to you all. I've taken about 5 minutes of our 45. The way we're going to do this evening is we're going to sort of address as much of the big questions as we can in about 45 minutes. We'll then take a 15-minute break, and then 30 minutes we will do Q&A, both here in the room and also online. We have Flo here who will be watching, so if you have questions that you want to ask, put them on the underneath, and we will try and make sure to include some of those. Johan, I'm going to start with you since you came all the way here from Sweden. You wrote that book. You were, again, one of the early voices questioning this. Sweden is now used as this sort of counterexample, and yet it was almost absent completely from the official COVID inquiry. What is the mood now in Sweden? Because we never really hear about that. Is everyone walking around smugly thinking we got this right and the rest of the world went mad, or what have people been?
No, but that's with all things like this, everyone was kind of in favor of the right approach in hindsight. So pretty much everyone was in favor of the strategy, even though they didn't say so at the time, or even like slightly opposed to it.
Mm. So the polling actually shows that, does it? It's a bit like the Iraq War, that no one remembers having been in favor of it at the time. It's sort of becoming one of those issues.
I haven't seen any polling like recently, but all the talking heads in the media are very much in favor of the strategy afterwards.
And what is your conclusion now, having studied it, you've written that book? Did Sweden get it right?
Yeah, I mean, there's like no other way of looking at it, because there was like the most amount of freedom in Europe and the fewest amounts of deaths. So it's like those are pretty much the only ways to measure this. And all the things that the epidemiologists in Sweden thought was going to happen actually came to materialize also. That everything would kind of level out in the end. Everyone would get it. It was basically herd immunity that was going to put an end to this. So I think they haven't been getting as much credit for it as they should have, at least internationally. In Sweden, people are kind of thankful that it ended up the way it did, but I think internationally, I mean, there are always like people asking me every now and then about the book and stuff, but it hasn't been like on the front page of the Times or anything like that.
Because the strange thing about the story of the Sweden example is that everyone wrote their verdicts at the moment where it looked the worst for Sweden, which was that winter of 2020 into 2021, when suddenly they had a spike, and it did look that things had gone wrong, and suddenly that was, if you now Google, did Sweden get COVID right, all of the verdicts written by the New York Times, The Guardian and mainstream press all seem to date from December 2020 or January 2021.
Yeah.
I haven't seen very many mea culpas or people revising their view. Have you noticed that?
No, I mean, there have been some books written by esteemed journalists, like in the US, but they didn't really have a view early on. But no one who, I mean, the European correspondent for the New York Times wrote that Sweden was the world's cautionary tale. And he hasn't written anything since.
On the topic?
No. So it's kind of strange. I've been wrong too, but I've never been wrong about something that fundamental. It's kind of interesting to think about how I would react if I were that wrong.
And Professor Giesecke, because we did a follow-up interview with him a year afterwards, where I now, in retrospect, feel we were quite harsh on him. I sort of forced him to admit those things that he had got wrong, and I think the story has got better and better for him since. We really should have him back. That can be our 5th year anniversary. We'll have a Giesecke special. Are you still in touch with him? Is he now? Because he became very controversial in Sweden.
Yes.
Even in Sweden, he was considered a kind of outlier. What's his reputation now?
I mean, it's pretty good. The problems he had in Sweden was that he was like an expert on TV, but then after a month, people realized he was also a Tegnell's advisor. So he had like a conflict of interest that he didn't really realize, since he wasn't really in that game to begin with. So he made a lot of like publicity mistakes, I guess, in the beginning. But then, I mean, now I think he's very like content with how things turned out.
So looking at his lake and having his daily swims, he's feeling quite pleased with himself, you think now? Well, let's hope so.
Yeah, let's hope.
Do you, Sunetra Gupta, do you think now, in retrospect, that Sweden got it right?
I've always thought that Sweden got it right, so there's no retrospective. But it's what you just said about freedom and how many deaths being the only two things to consider, I'd somewhat disagree with, because I think you can go deeper than that, and that's where I think the COVID inquiry is going wrong. Because what you can do is you can look at the situation more analytically and say exactly what did Sweden do, and was there an intelligent way to use non-pharmaceutical interventions to actually achieve the best outcome. And effectively what happened everywhere is something that can be explained. You have to go into the epidemiology of it. You have to understand how herd immunity plays a role. And if you combine a very simple model which combines herd immunity with seasonality, will give you the patterns that we saw in Sweden, very similar patterns here as well. And overall, we can explain everything that happened without invoking non-pharmaceutical interventions. So then you sort of start to think, well, where do they come in? What did they do? And there's still this sort of, I think, a religious fervour, a religious belief that these, I'll just call them lockdowns stopped the spread. So even those who are in favour of the Swedish approach often say, well, what happened in Sweden really is that people locked down voluntarily. So what they're saying is lockdowns work, but they don't need to be mandated. I don't think that's true. I think that non-pharmaceutical interventions work well at an individual level. They work to reduce individual risk. And that's basically what Sweden got right, is that it promoted the reduction, individual risk reduction. There was state support, and also, of course, the health system managed to implement individual risk reduction. And what people can't get their heads around is that the same things that can reduce individual risk actually don't stop the spread of an epidemic, and that's pretty much been borne out. So fundamentally what Sweden did was it managed to get people to reduce their individual risk, avoided the costs of lockdown, which are profound, so much so that even if lockdowns did work to stop the spread, I don't think they're the solution. And so, yes, it did do well, but it's worth thinking about why.
Yeah. So, in other words, if you are old or vulnerable or you're worried about it and you choose to lock yourself in your bedroom and not leave, you will most likely not get a virus, even if it's everywhere. To try and roll out that mechanism at a population level just doesn't work because there are too many leaks.
Yes, it's a bit like, and it particularly does not work to stop the spread of an epidemic. So if you think of an epidemic as a big wave, and the endemic equilibrium to which we've now settled, and which is what we enjoy with other diseases, as small waves, if you put up a barrier, the small waves might, at least temporarily, be halted, and that's what we saw with flu. But a big wave will just wash over it, and that's effectively what happened. But all of this can be backed up with very simple, straightforward mathematics without making too many assumptions about anything.
So I want to come back to the science in 1 second, but just to finish on Sweden, why, Johan, do you think that of all of the 28 countries, Sweden went a different direction? It was a remarkable thing, given the amount of pressure. Why was it that Sweden, of all places, didn't do a lockdown?
It was partly a fluke that these people were in charge of, at the authority, because one has to say that Anders Tegnell and Johan Giesecke, they're kind of more stubborn than the average Swede. and also the constitution also has a role to play here, because it's very difficult for politicians to override the decisions of the government authorities. But also a little bit of a fluke was that these people kind of knew a lot about the Imperial College modeling that was so that played such a big role in England, for instance, and like Anders Tegnell had co-authored articles with Neil Ferguson and so on. So there's a really interesting email chain when they talk about what a bunch of dilettantes these people are, and that's not. They didn't say anything like that in public, but like when they were writing to each other, it was very clear that they didn't hold them in very high regard at all.
Mm. So Sweden lucked out by having some quite stubborn,
and also knowledgeable
in the right
people.
jobs.
Yeah,
Interesting.
definitely.
Thomas, I want to just open up the question of the politics here before we kind of really get stuck in. Your book is a sobering read, but what do you think happened in terms of the political atmosphere, and why did this become such a surreal and centrally controlled political narrative, do you think?
Well, I think from a political standpoint, the most interesting thing concerning Sweden is what you mentioned. I mean, the level of international pressure that was applied on the country. I think that in itself was virtually unprecedented. And I think, in a way, it contradicts. So you kind of have two general, in the kind of COVID-critical sphere, you've got two, I would say, general kind of frames of understanding of what happened. You can say it was a cock-up, driven by confusion, chaos, paranoia on behalf of the elites. They didn't know what to do. There was big demand for them to do something, and they just went for the easiest thing to do, which in that case happened to be lockdowns, regardless of what the consequences might have been. This is one way of seeing it, and then you've got another way of seeing it, which is that it was one big conspiracy, and that in fact, the outcome was the desired outcome, and that there were centers of power that were driving these policies, and I think the truth is somewhere in between. Clearly, at many levels, including at the political level, I think a lot of people and organizations were reacting out of panic. They were following groupthink. They were simply going along with what others were doing. So there was a strong element of groupthink. But at the same time, it's pretty clear, I think, that very early on, a granitic narrative emerged in terms of what needed to be done. And I think this kind of contradicts with the idea that this was a panicked response and individual governments were just trying to figure out what to do. In fact, what we saw was that in the early weeks of 2020, a granitic narrative emerged, which basically went along the lines of, we are in the presence of a highly deadly disease which threatens everyone, regardless of age, of pre-existing conditions, etc., etc. There are no effective therapies. And the only solution we have to avoid mass casualties, millions and millions of deaths, is to lock down until a vaccine is developed, at which point we will have to vaccinate almost everyone on the entire planet. And at that point, maybe we will be able to emerge from the pandemic. And this, what we call this single narrative in the book, was really rammed through on a global level. I mean, this was the first time, I think, that billions of people across the planet were exposed to one single overarching narrative, which was ruthlessly imposed, not just through the traditional media, but as we now know, also through very sophisticated levels of censorship on social media. And clearly, someone was driving this narrative. This narrative didn't just emerge out of nowhere. The pressure that was applied on Sweden, didn't just emerge out of thin air. I think, there were sectors in society, very powerful sectors in society. There were converging interests, I think, that converged very early on to come up with this single narrative, which then turned into a single policy response, which was imposed with very few exceptions across the board, especially in Western countries. So I think And so I think this is the big question that the inquiry probably can't answer, because some of the implications, I think, are too profound. I mean, you can't expect states to put themselves on trial when, crimes have been committed at the highest level of state power. But I think the real question that we haven't really answered is, who was really driving these policies, and so this kind of dichotomy of cock-up versus conspiracy kind of runs through our entire book. And there is no single answer, because that's probably the wrong question. As I said, it's probably neither just one nor the other. But I think that's what's fascinating to me when it comes to Sweden, that governments were subjected to such massive pressure, to the point that elected officials, presidents of two of the most powerful countries in the world, the US and the UK, were effectively bullied into adopting that policy response. And so I think that points to me to the fact that power has somewhat shifted away from governments to other centers of power, which really revealed themselves during the pandemic.
I'm just going to share my take on this, if I may. I know I'm supposed to be the chair here, but I have an opinion. It's probably not a secret. I don't think. I veer much more towards the cock-up thesis. Occam's razor. I feel like, for me, what was in a way more frightening, because this, in a way, if these things are directed by distant powers that are kind of all-knowing, in a way that's a more comforting world. To me, it's even more frightening if it's actually just emergent from fear and panic and groupthink, which I'm afraid I think is more credible. But what I have never recovered from, and I would say it changed my worldview completely, is how casually people regarded freedom, and how light our attachment was to living in a free society. So it wasn't that people were upset about this, they were asking for it. And the people in this room, I would guess, would have taken a different view in large measure, but there is no easy answer for that. And I think to me, it shows just how fragile our entire kind of civilization can be. Throw in true fear and confusion, and suddenly we're right back where we started. So that's my little intervention there.
Yeah, I agree on that as well. I think it's 100% incompetence and cowardice that created this. But it was kind of interesting in Sweden because Anders Tegnell had a press conference every day, and it's kind of like the tables were turned, because normally it's journalists who are asking questions about liberty, but it was Anders Tegnell and the others who were like, yeah, it's kind of important that you get to do this, and that, and all the journalists were like, lock us up.
That's interesting.
So I think it was an emergent property, but I don't think it came out of cowardice and whatnot. I think it was an emergent property of the current system that we have, which Tom was just talking about, where the power is distributed in a particular way, and wealth is distributed in a way. Wealth now becoming more coterminous with power than it ever has been. Before there was wealth, and you buy your yacht and do what you like. But now, somehow, philanthrocapitalism and all these peculiar concepts, well, they're not just concepts, they are actually happening, are in practice. And I think it is an emergent property, but not of cowardice, not of people panicking, but it's an emergent property. And this is articulated very well in Thomas, the Covid Consensus book. We were set up for this. In academia, we were set up for this because so much now depends on your grant income, your what you publish, and it's become very individualistic. Academia used to be communitarian but very hierarchical, and now it's become less hierarchical but much more individualistic. And I think that's what it emerges from. So I do think it's emergent. I don't think there was a conspiracy in the classic sort of sense of people sitting.
And also, perhaps the global frame of reference felt very particularly true during COVID in a way that in previous crises it hadn't. You know, endless comparisons of countries, and there are these huge supranational organisations which played an oversized role, and as you say, big philanthropists. There was a sense that the unit of the country, that's why Sweden's sort of
Well, there was a
exception
sort
is
of
so
league
remarkable.
table, yes, which was pathetic. But there was also, I mean, to me, what was more disturbing than people willing to give up their freedom was the lack of understanding of how these policies would harm themselves, but also, you know, the world at large, and particularly the global south, and which is why we set up a charity, Collateral Global, and I think, is Kevin around? Yeah, here's Kevin. Kevin is currently directing that. So for me, what was much more important than people willing to relinquish their freedom was their people's inability to see how much harm was being caused globally, and also within the country, to the poor, to the young. And, you know, now it's tangible. We can see it. But why couldn't we see it 4 years ago?
Well, partly because of the massive propaganda campaign that was implemented. I mean, let's not forget what the climate was like. So in defense of the people, I think we're forgetting what the climate was and how across the board, across all mainstream media, they were just pushing one narrative, and that is that COVID is this incredibly deadly illness, and if you don't lock down, you're going to die. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that, you know, not everyone did their own research and, you know, came to their own conclusions, because, of course, if that's what you're told day and night for weeks, months, years, of course you're going to believe that. I mean, so let's not forget, and again, so I think that kind of contrasts with the idea that, you know, this was just one big cock-up determined by confusion and panic, because someone was driving this narrative across the board, across countries.
In your version,
and,
who is that someone?
There's not, again, it's not a room where a bunch of people come together, but clearly there have been, I mean, let's analyse, let's look at who benefited from these policies. So we know that during lockdown, big tech companies, you know, reaped unprecedented profits. Many of these big tech companies were engaged in censoring dissenting voices, voices that were critical of lockdown. Obviously, we know the incredible profits that that big pharma made out of the vaccines. Again, I mean, to think that it's just a coincidence that the most powerful sectors at the pinnacle of Western capitalist societies just happened to be the main beneficiaries of these policies, and that this was just a coincidence, I think is a bit naive.
Don't you just think it's just a global groupthink?
I think that's a bit of a simplistic explanation, because you know, the ones that were driving the groupthink also happened to benefit from those policies. So what you're saying is that it's just a coincidence that
But what is new
the companies
now?
that were pushing these policies also happen to be the main beneficiaries of these companies.
But what is
policies.
new now is that people kind of read the same stuff. Like if you're a newspaper editor in France, you read The Economist and The Guardian. And the same thing in Sweden and Denmark. Whereas
UnHerd.
20 years ago, 20 years ago, there wasn't really that kind of elite media that everyone read across the world. And I think that played a huge part in this COVID consensus that you...
I'm rather surprised that you say, Thomas, what else are people supposed to do? I would expect, and I did expect, and I was wrong, that most people that I knew, anyway, would say, does this make sense? And they didn't. So I think there's something that's happened that has eroded the capacity of people for critical thinking.
I completely agree. I don't want to downplay too much the propaganda element, because I think that's a
but I'm
crucial
just saying, how did
part
it
of this
breach
story.
the normal, capabilities of critical thinking that most educated?
Well, I would say that social media, I think, played a role, a very negative role, in the sense that prior to social media, how many hours a day could you be exposed to propaganda? Maybe in the morning, while you were driving to work, you would listen to the radio and maybe be exposed to some propaganda, and maybe a bit more propaganda when you open the newspaper, and maybe a bit more propaganda in the evening when you looked at the news. Nowadays, if you're getting most of your news from social media, and as we now know, the information flow on those social media platforms is being micromanaged. in order to amplify the panic and to marginalize all dissenting voices. And we know during lockdown people were living attached to their phones, and so potentially you're exposed to propaganda almost 24/7. And so I think that's an important element to take into consideration.
Definitely.
A very negative role that social media platforms play.
I think that's right. And to have a moment of optimism here, it did end. I mean, we are here.
Did it?
Well, let's have that conversation because. Let's have that conversation because I remember speaking to lots of people who were deep into, the darkness of the moment, who were just convinced that they would never be allowed out again, and that they would always roll. There'd be a new variant. They would be into a never-ending dynamic. And yet, every event, we, in the middle of lockdown, decided to open this club because we wanted people to gather again in person. Every event has been sold out. People are coming together. That now feels a little bit like a nightmarish memory. And actually, a lot of the gains of a lot of those companies have been destroyed. A lot of the gains of some of the vaccine companies have lost a lot of value. Zoom, everyone got very excited about. Huge gains, and it, of course, crashed. So that reality, in a sense, has reasserted itself in the post-lockdown. Do I have any support for that thesis?
No.
Not in the audience.
We always
We're
knew
here.
we would reach endemic equilibrium. That was inevitable, and we have.
We do have to cover some. We did grandly call this the alternative COVID inquiry. So let's cover some of the key points. Sunetra, do you feel is the single biggest idea from a scientific point of view that has been kept out or misunderstood in the COVID inquiry that you would like people to understand?
Well, I think I've already explained that I think this sort of religious belief in lockdowns, being able to stop the spread of a virus or any kind of human intervention, the role of human intervention needs to be explored, but it needs to be looked at in a more nuanced way. So you don't have to go, throw it out completely. Well, what can you do? How can you intervene? But instead what's happened is, as I said, there's just this slavish kind of acceptance of this idea that you when you intervene, you can stop it, but I mean, what people have started to say...
So do you think lockdowns worked at all?
No, I don't think they did.
You don't think they made any difference to the sort of passage of the virus?
I think it would be very difficult to defend a position that it did.
So does that mean that had all of those countries not locked down, you think the spread, the deaths, the hospitalizations, all of that would have looked roughly the same as it did anyway?
I mean, it would seem so from what looking at these different country by country compare. I mean, if you look at Sweden and any other country, there isn't a lot of difference, or such difference as there are cannot really be explained by non-pharmaceutical interventions. Until we opened up, I always used to say that the dynamics of the virus up till that point could be explained either way. You could say it's all due to herd immunity and seasonality, or it's completely due to lockdowns. How do you tell? Well, the only way to tell is to test. And we tested it by opening up. And we didn't get this massive exit wave, which would have happened were it all had been controlled by lockdowns. So that was sort of, two competing hypotheses being tested, and herd immunity and seasonality won hands down.
We haven't mentioned vaccines yet. I feel we should introduce that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you take the vaccine?
Yes, I did, because I was over 50 and I thought that if you are to protect the vulnerable, or only offer it to the vulnerable, then you have to have a cut-off. I think 50 is not a good cut-off. But I felt like I was in a pact with the government where they would they would jab us and then leave everyone under 50 alone. It was kind of promised to us, and then that didn't happen.
So what should have happened?
What should have happened is the vaccine should only have been offered to those who were vulnerable. And you can ask, who are those people? Well, clearly the elderly, but even among the elderly, not everyone was really at risk. But still, you have to have some kind of cut-off. So I suppose you determine that from the existing data. And then there were clear comorbidities clear associations with certain comorbid conditions. So you would give it to those people. And what I recommended at that point was that you should not give it to people who are at no risk almost of dying of COVID. Because it was an untested vaccine. It was bound, or it was likely that some people would die from it. And it's unacceptable that that should happen if people are not at risk of dying from COVID.
So is your position that net, the vaccines saved lives or not?
If from a biological standpoint, knowing how immunity to coronaviruses evolves, I would say yes, if the people who were vulnerable and had not previously been exposed to COVID, getting the vaccine was very much the right thing to do. And presumably it saved lives. The reason I say presumably is because we don't know yet how many people had already been exposed. So already had. So the idea here is that as soon as you're exposed to COVID, you develop immunity against severe disease and death. This is true of the other coronaviruses. It's true of many other diseases, malaria, flu. So it's very likely to be true of SARS-CoV-2. So we don't know how many people who got vaccinated were already immune to severe disease and death. So it's going to be very difficult to tell just exactly how many people were saved.
So you're not one of these people who puts the excess deaths that we've seen since the COVID era, you don't connect that with the vaccine, you would have other explanations for that?
Yes, I would blame lockdowns. I don't think it's likely to be due to vaccines. Again, Sweden, of course, vaccinated much of its population, and I think it's very important
and no excess death is
no excess.
better.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that there was a very low risk, but that also acknowledge that it was unacceptable for that low risk, for people who didn't need to be exposed to that low risk, and that people did die because of it.
Johan, did vaccines become controversial in Sweden in the same way they did in other countries?
I think that was the most controversial thing throughout the pandemic, actually, because Sweden has a very high vaccine uptake in general. 97% of all kids get all the shots for everything they need to get. But for some reason, the government decided to have like some kind of perfunctory vaccine passport that didn't really make any difference either way. But it was like such a big break with tradition that lots of people got really upset. Lots of like new people started debating this who hadn't like had a very strong view on COVID before. But I think it only lasted like 7 weeks or something like that. But it cost like everyone very much, I think.
So there was actually the reverse effect, that more people were suspicious
than
before.
And lots of people have since been more critical towards the public health authorities, and it's like opened up a new Pandora's box of suspicion towards the authorities.
And that was always a problem, that it would cause vaccine hesitancy against vaccines that actually are necessary and important. And that's come to pass.
Yeah.
Thomas, I mean, you're I would say a dissident from the orthodoxy on some of these topics. In a way, and I would say UnHerd has been to various degrees, but there's been a whole blossoming, you could say, of kind of anti-authoritarian thinking since COVID. You talk very eloquently about the one narrative and how incredibly effective that was, and yet here we are 4 years later, and it feels like the kind of the dissident groups or the new media outlets, channels that are not centrally controlled, etc., have blossomed, and there may be attempts to try and keep them in order, but they're not being very successful. It feels like if the game was to put us into a single narrative world, it hasn't gone very well.
I would argue it's been very successful. I mean, let's remember what time we were coming from. We were coming from the kind of the populist uprising of the second half of the 2010s, Trump, Brexit, the yellow vests in France, and similar phenomena in other countries. So the West was very much in upheaval in the years leading up to COVID. And I think the pandemic was a very effective way of effectively, pretty much freezing politics for 2 years. I would say the pandemic played a crucial role in getting Trump out of office, not an insignificant gain from the perspective of certain quarters. And I think it was a very effective way in effectively, again, freezing for 2 years what was a growing populist uprising against the status quo in the West. And of course, it was obvious that we were never going to stay in lockdown forever. But I think the mode of governance that was inaugurated by COVID, I think we're still living in that mode, in that authoritarian mode of governments, the same way of treating new crises, whether it's the war in Ukraine or Gaza or climate change. We see the same authoritarian approach, the same marginalization of critical voices, the same censorship happening on major social media platforms, maybe with the exception of X post-Musk. So I see very much the same tactics being deployed to keep at bay what are new uprisings that are, of course, simmering under the surface because, things are not well in the West, and I would say it's proving quite effective. I would say in allowing an elite that is completely delegitimized in the eyes of a growing number of people, and that is what you could consider the positive, the silver lining of COVID. That trust in governments and institutions has fallen dramatically, but at the same time they're using those same tactics to remain in power despite their growing lack of legitimacy, by stoking fear, by resorting to unprecedented levels of propaganda, of harmonization of the narrative throughout the legacy media. So I would say that the COVID method is still proving quite effective in controlling Western societies.
Okay, Johan and Sunetra, I'm going to ask you to give one final thought before we go to our break. If we have an alternative inquiry here, what is the item you would put on the agenda and you would like most people to believe differently about than they do?
I think, of course, lockdowns, and maybe widen it to social engineering in general. That it's much more difficult and works less well than you think, because very few examples of that has worked historically, and it's much more complex than you would believe.
Yeah, the sort of top-down grand plan we should be suspicious of. Sunetra, what idea would you leave us?
Well, I've always, this is the third time I'm saying it, is lockdowns, and how to, I think, using the role of logic in all of this. I mean, I often say that, if you can defeat something, if you think of the way where people agree, consensus, logic is where most people would generally agree with the principles, the logical arguments. And then, of course, going out from logic, you have the ethics and the politics and all of that. But if you can defeat something at the level of logic, then I think, not home and dry, but, you've got something that's unassailable to a degree.
You'd like to see
So
a return of critical thinking.
I'd like to see logic being involved in thinking about lockdowns rather than faith and emotion.
Question for Sunetra. What do you think about the Office of National Statistics changing the goalposts for excess deaths? And also, why didn't you get sacked by Oxford University?
Why didn't I get sacked?
Yeah. Because I think Martin Kulldorff had problems at Harvard.
Oxford University were largely supportive. I mean, they weren't supportive to the extent that they told people to stop harassing me, but when they came to I mean, there was no question that they wanted to protect me, and I think overall the belief, my conversations with people like the Vice Chancellor at the time, and certainly the Vice Chancellor, the current Vice Chancellor, who was then head of my college, were all very positive and supportive. I'm not saying that there weren't issues with, some. Clearly, there were people who really wanted me to be sacked. I know that. I've been told so, and there have been consequences. For example, I've not been invited to be part of the Pandemic Institute, the new Pandemic Sciences Institute. So there are all sorts of repercussions, but by and large, Oxford University have been supportive, not just tolerant, of my opinion. What was the other question?
The ONS.
Oh, the ONS. That I found that very peculiar indeed. I was clearly motivated by a need to show that you could interpret the data a different way. And then there was that strange little video that accompanied it, which where the person finally says, well, this is just what it is. It's a way of estimating excess deaths and nothing more, nothing less. And this is something mathematicians or modelers often do. They say, well, it's just a model, as if that's okay. It's not okay. Models, it's true, have huge uncertainty, and the way that modelling was used to convey a sense of certainty during this period was really unfortunate. But I think that these exercises where it's not a good look for the evidence.
Okay, let's get another question. Yes?
Two quick questions. Who do you think will defend a non-pharmaceutical intervention these days, one? And how would you set up an inquiry to highlight this aspect? And I make this maybe a kind of a background on this. If you see I think there's an increasing alliance. I agree with the fact that the optimism that you shared, Freddie, but I disagree with the point of, and also with the fact that the gains have lost, but the structure of the market has not. If you see the contracting between, not in Europe, but in the global south, the contracting for the vaccines, they show a defense by the government of the companies against the citizens, which implies an alliance between government and companies supported by tech. Now, in that context,
So what's the question?
the question are those two questions. In that context, who defends non-pharmaceutical interventions, which are obviously against these monopolies? And two, how will you set up an inquiry to defend these, to highlight these non-pharmaceutical approaches?
I mean, I wouldn't know how to stop them from occurring again. I think what we're trying to do here is to spread awareness about the just how negative they were in the first place. I don't know. I mean, would people accept a new round of lockdowns?
I wouldn't.
I don't know. They'd probably have to come up with something even scarier than COVID.
I mean, we do have efforts in place, obviously. The Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford and Collateral Global, we are trying to provide an evidence-based for this, for NPIs. And again, as I said, mentioned the more subtle approach to, when does it work, when does it not work, does it achieve the stated aims, and at what cost? But I think what's important is also to actually gather an evidence base for alternatives like focused protection. To do some studies saying, let's try with 2 care homes, let's try this option versus that, and then show that works. Next time, let's do that. So I think this is actually something we can do, and some of us are trying to do it, but in your preamble, what you said, I think, speaks more to what
And I
Thomas
think maybe
was
we should
talking about.
also try to get a bit specific when we talk of NPIs, because just talking about lockdowns in a general sense can be a bit deceiving. Also, when we're trying to understand how what did they contribute to? Did they save lives? Did they contribute to a higher number of deaths? I think it's important to get into the kind of nitty-gritty details of what some of those lockdown-related policies were, and some of them were, patently absurd. And again, we saw them across the board in pretty much all Western countries, such as taking COVID patients from hospitals and putting them in care homes among the, what were known to be the most fragile people. And we know that, especially in the first wave, something in the order of 40% of deaths were registered in care homes. So I think it's also important to ask ourselves, to what extent did specific decisions that were made during lockdown contribute not just to non-COVID related deaths, but even to contribute, even to a higher number of COVID deaths themselves. I mean, because otherwise, we're also, I think, alleviating people of their, even of their, I would say, criminal responsibilities in some cases, because the decision to take COVID patients and put them in care homes, I think, is something that should have been taken up by way more courts and judges. That has been the case, and not just in the UK, but in a number of countries.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because the reason that the hospitals were emptied to put people into care homes was because we were expecting this situation like we had seen in Italy, in your country. Was the health system actually, quote-unquote, overwhelmed in Italy? I mean, that's the central claim, isn't it? That most European countries said, had we not done that, we would have faced what they saw in northern Italy. Has anyone actually done a forensic analysis of what happened in Italy? Was the health system ever overwhelmed?
I mean, there have been. I mean, what happened in the very early weeks of March 2020 in northern Italy is still almost unexplained. I mean, you have this massive spike in deaths, which then very quickly declines. And it's really not clear what caused that, and again, to what extent the protocols contributed to that, to the extent that they told people to simply stay at home and take paracetamol if they were feeling sick, and only to call the ambulance when their fever went above 40 or whatever. So already in the very early days of the Italian response to the pandemic, you can see how these protocols had a very negative effect also on ultimately on the number of deaths. But aside from that early spike, throughout most of the pandemic, occupancy rates were hardly ever near critical levels. And again, they kept saying they were. And then we would go and look, we would take out the data and say, look, that's not true. I mean, occupancy levels are not, and this is something that was the case in other countries as well. But in Italy, it was very, very clear. I mean, we kept saying. I mean, very few people tried to make the case that, in fact, occupancy levels were hardly ever at emergency rates. But that was a narrative that was being driven throughout the media, which is why people wouldn't go to the hospital to get cured.
Yeah. So I think clearly, I mean, to start with, there were many deaths, and they could be attributed to policy mistakes and also to medical mismanagement. But I disagree.
Ventilators.
I don't think we should criminalise anybody for that. We must. I think we should grant amnesty on that, because people just did what they thought they needed to do at the time. I mean, a young doctor saying, "Oh God, we must ventilate someone." I wouldn't blame them. I would like them not to feel comfortable. Not
the individual doctors, but policy
we should
policy
learn
decisions
from them,
were made.
I think it's important.
I think they should be held accountable.
Well,
again,
I think I think we should learn from it. I don't. In terms of hospital capacity, yes, I don't think it was breached, probably. But even if it had been breached, what's the solution to that? Well, create a system where we have the flexibility during a pandemic. There may be one coming which really does strain hospital capacity. Well, what do you do? What's the solution to that?
Well,
Increase hospital capacity.
We created 30,000 additional beds, did we not? And I think only 27 of them were ever used.
The Nightingale hospitals. No, but you also need to set up things like fever camps. Yeah. We should move away from these sort of monolithic structures like the John Ratcliffe Hospital, which, where next door to me, where everyone comes to be treated rather than having the more local hospitals. We need to rethink the system so we have some sort of resilience against these events.
Let's take another question, sorry, Thomas, because we've got to get some. Yeah, and there's a lady just over here.
Me?
Oh, yes, there's a lady back there. There's also a lady back there. There's time for both.
If there's one phrase that drove me mad during COVID and the pandemic, it was "we're following the science." When it's very apparent that there wasn't any science to be following, at least not coherently. But my question is that whatever you think of our systems and the way we make decisions, we have frameworks for making decisions. We do risk assessments, we assess quality of life, we rationalise our health service, and we make choices. All of the frameworks for that decision making seem to disappear during COVID, and we actually abandoned huge swathes of the population to save certain people because we consider them more vulnerable. And we're paying a very, very high price for that now. And an example of that, just been mentioned, is we opened all these extra beds in hospitals. We forgot to work out that you needed staff, not just buildings. And a friend of mine is a doctor, and he said, well, we've got all these extra beds, but we've got absolutely no staff to send there. So my question is, why did we not follow the science and abandon all our logic and our ability to make rational decisions?
And we're going to take this lady's question in a moment, but I wonder, Johan, Sweden did manage to keep its architecture of decision-making in place.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And that's actually a constitutional difference, isn't it, in some way?
Yeah, it's a very strange system where in Sweden, the most common way for a government minister to resign is that he has been micromanaging something. So they're not supposed to make decisions at all when it comes to lower level
policy.
So they're more like a chairman of the board of a company than the CEO. So that's a very strange and different system, and it doesn't work at all in some cases, and it worked really well here because the people were. We don't have a chief surgeon or anything like that, so the politicians didn't know a thing about science, and it kind of.
So in this
a good
case,
thing here.
It was a bit of a paradox, actually,
Yeah.
for those of us who were worried about too much technocracy and not enough democracy.
Saved
Actually,
by technocracy.
in a way, Sweden was saved by the fact that it had such a technocracy. The elected representatives couldn't interfere.
Yeah.
So stubborn old Anders Tegnell and Johanna Giesecke they stuck to their playbook that they'd done for 10 years and they were not going to budge.
Yeah, and also maybe it's a good thing that the politicians know how little they know. That they don't try to come up with new solutions. Because basically, this pandemic wasn't that different from other pandemics. When it's it's a virus that's kind of dangerous for some people, and all the old playbooks worked, and they should have just stuck to them.
Johan, am I allowed to say what the topic of your new book is?
The power of doing nothing.
Johan has been so moved by this. He's writing a whole book about the importance of doing nothing. And I really think more people can pay attention to that lesson. Yes.
Yes, I am one of, I think we were close to 1 million NHS workers in this country who actually doubled or tripled my hours during the pandemic. And 2 weeks before I was sacked, they decided not to sack us. So my question is, in many parts of Europe, healthcare professionals didn't have the same luck that we had in this country for whatever reason.
Why would they have sacked you? Sorry.
Because I was not vaccinated,
Right.
I decided to not take, which I don't think it's a vaccine. I think it's an mRNA therapy. We shouldn't be call it. It's not the proper way of calling it. But my question is, I was lucky. Yeah, we fought. We went to the streets. We made a big protest here in Trafalgar. I don't know if any of you were here with us. Thank you. We were there, right? But many parts of the world did not have the same luck that we did. What is needed? What kind of measures do we need to put into place and to think as a society so that this type of discrimination never occurs in the future? That's my question to you all. Thank you.
Who would like to? Sunetra? So, as a vaccine specialist.
Okay, so I think what's needed is logic. This is a vaccine, but it's a vaccine that protects against severe disease and death. It's not a vaccine that protects against transmission or infection. And this could have been predicted right at the end, many of us did, because coronaviruses, when you get infected by them, you don't develop immunity against further infection like you do with measles. Measles vaccine, you take it, you're never going to get measles again. Coronavirus vaccine, if you take it, it will protect you against severe disease and death, because the first infection with any coronavirus does that. But it's not going to stop you from getting infected unless you do something very sophisticated, which obviously you can't do in 9 months or less than that, which is at the time that it took to develop it. So all we could possibly expect from this vaccine was that it protected you against severe disease. Therefore, you should only give it to those who are vulnerable. And you shouldn't take it if you're not vulnerable, because there's always a little risk.
What is so extraordinary is that these vaccine mandates, if what you're saying is true, and I think we can't dispute that, have lasted so long. You know, there was an initial claim that there was going to be 95% efficacy and people weren't going to get infected. That was very quickly abandoned. And I read there are still vaccine mandates in American universities, in some companies, etc. COVID, and now we're 4 years later. Does anyone have an explanation of how, following your question really, how did that come about, and what do we need to do to try and restore common sense on that question?
My idea is that, especially in the case of vaccine mandates, profit played a huge role. I mean, I think there were huge pressures coming from extremely powerful actors in society, which had to benefit immensely from those vaccine mandates, because they wouldn't have made those profits if the vaccines had not been more or less coercively imposed across the board. They would have made, 50, 40, 30% of the profits they made, and that makes a big difference when we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. So I've got a very kind of prosaic interpretation of what happened. I mean, maybe because I'm an old leftist, and so to me, profit plays a big role in capitalist societies. And I think, especially in the case of vaccines, to me, it's pretty clear that there was, incredible levels of corruption that were happening at all levels. I mean, we know that the regulatory institutions were captured by big pharmaceutical companies. I mean, this is not. I mean, this is all kind of established facts, and they still are to this day. So the kind of institutional capture, I think, played a crucial role. And someone mentioned this nexus between state and corporate power.
But the question, just to restate the question, is what do we need to do to prevent that happening, so that your situation, you said you were lucky, but still obviously very difficult here, and you're right, a lot of people in the health services in other countries were just sacked. What do we need to do to get more Swedish common sense?
I don't think it will happen again, because I think the vaccines were kind of like an exit ramp for many politicians throughout Europe, because they had been telling people that we have to lock down, and now they had like a solution to get out of it, because there was like no reason to stop locking down without the vaccine. So with the vaccine they could say, okay, now we're done with this. Like in Denmark, it took like maybe like 2 days before they're like, we're done with this now.
Just, I mean, we did, Jay Bhattacharya and I wrote an article saying, yay, you know, we have the vaccine, now we can stop it. But what we said is now, let's vaccinate the vulnerable. We didn't say what was illogical to vaccinate everybody. But I have to agree with Thomas that what needs to happen is a dismantling of that whole structure that leads to this kind of greed being manifest. And perhaps at the very least, even capitalist societies can decide that during an emergency like this, all of that should be transferred to, I mean, I'm not saying the governments did very well on this, but at least take it away from Big Pharma.
Because
I mean, it has to,
otherwise you will see the same logic at play with different crises. So now we see foreign policy being hijacked by the military-industrial complex.
Exactly.
But it's exactly the same logic at play. More generally, I think what we need is a new Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, because all the safeguards and constitutional safeguards and guardrails that we've created in the West, especially in the post-war period, were completely just thrown to the bushes. So what we need is what we would need is a collective conversation about where we reestablish what are fundamental rights that cannot be violated, whatever the case. And these can relate to human bodily autonomy, and they can relate to freedom of speech. Unfortunately, we're not moving in that direction. That is why I'm not as optimistic as you are. I see governments doubling down on censorship. I see governments doubling down on the criminalization of dissent. Now we've got across Europe police raiding political meetings.
So you think it can happen again?
I mean, it won't. Not exactly along those same lines, but those same logics, I think, can be applied again, and maybe it'll be with regard to climate change, and to some extent we're already seeing it. The 15-minute cities. You can't leave your neighborhood because otherwise you're going to pollute too much, we might. So again, we see those same logics at play, and there are, of course, already talking of disease X, which isn't very reassuring, obviously.
But I have to say that there is some unwinding of this. Like the United States Supreme Court has had some pretty beautiful writing about how politicians got into panic and felt like they had to do something. So there is some kind of unwinding going on as well. But I do agree that there are some worrying trends also, like in Canada, for instance.
Let's take one. What we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions, actually. Maybe. Well, we've actually already had a conversation, so I think we'll go to there's a gentleman at the back, and there's some people over here, and then we'll spread it around a bit.
Yeah, my question is on overturning the consensus and how firm is that consensus. So I don't think we're going to expect, there's for me a remarkable kind of level of consensus both at the distributed elites level and at the public level, which still, from the kind of polls I've seen, still seems to be fairly firm. And I guess my question to the panel is, what are the routes to overturning that, or maybe leveraging any cracks that you see in that consensus? And my guess is that we've got more of a chance kind of swaying the public than the elites that have had to own that policy.
What we'll do is we'll take actually 2 or 3 questions, and then, because we're running out of time, so we'll take one from the back. Yes, great.
Thank you. Referring to this country, we have the National Health Service. We can't talk rashly about it in this country, at least in politics. A certain referendum was swung on the promise of spending more money on it. Was the lockdown itself fundamentally a panicked reaction of protecting the NHS at all costs, because the system in charge just, it didn't see where the wave was coming? Dominic Cummings has spoken about this on Substack. The whole system panicked, and it was all about protecting the NHS at all costs. And at all costs, I mean at all costs, regardless of what happened in the future.
Dominic Cummings, not someone I would follow pandemic. But there's a lady up at the front here.
I've already got it.
What? Oh, you've already got it. Okay, go for it.
Quick question. How significant do you think it was that China established the lockdown model, and do you think the rest of the world would have followed that model if it had not started in an authoritarian country?
Okay. Why don't we... You can pick whichever of those questions you like. We are running out of time, so we're going to just do one kind of summary answer each.
Okay, I'll
Johan,
take
let's go
China
first
really
with you.
fast. So many writers throughout the world, and in Sweden also, wrote that this is like the way, like this was supposed to be China's Chernobyl moment, but it became the West's Chernobyl moment. But in fact, it showed that the Chinese way of government is like deeply flawed. That they were like locked down even when they had the Olympics, when the rest of the world had been free for like a year. So and they're still suffering from the lockdowns pretty much. So I think this, you probably won't agree, but I think it shows that like democracy is pretty resilient and has a way of like adapting itself to like new and like making mistakes and coming back.
I think our response was worse than China's. I mean, I don't want to, don't want to make a defense of China, but I mean, I think let's never forget
they welded
that
people into their homes, did they?
that was not a government policy, but without getting into details, it's simply looking in terms of the scope of the lockdowns. Let's not forget that beyond Wuhan, even if we take the entire Hubei region, that accounts for about 3% of the Chinese population. So it's as if they had put into lockdown a small British town. So that was never a national lockdown. And in fact, China never really had national lockdowns of the kind that we had. They were always, to a large degree, localized lockdowns. This is not to defend China. Those lockdowns were wrong as well. But the idea that I think that we did better than China and that we had a less authoritarian response.
So you're actually making the case that
questionable.
China is less authoritarian than the West?
I think their response to COVID was less authoritarian than ours. China never had nationwide vaccine passports. I'm not saying this to defend China. I'm saying we need to take a good look in the mirror, simply because when it comes to vaccine mandates, we had harsher policies than they had. They never had nationwide vaccine passports. That's a fact.
Underscores the point that authoritarianism per se is not what underlies what happened. It's greed. It's a lack of communitarianism. It's individualism and greed that led to this. It's not, it started in China. So what? I mean, no one's ever said, since when have the West followed China? So and to blame it and to keep calling it CCP-type lockdowns actually really annoys me, because it's, you're missing the point. The point is this happened here. And it was endorsed by the public.
And initially, the consensus was that what China was doing was completely unacceptable. I mean, if you go and take, the early articles in The Guardian and in papers that, subsequently embraced lockdowns, they were highly critical of the lockdowns in China. They said, the very short history that we have of lockdowns show that they don't work. And then, of course, they have a whole series of social and economic repercussions that, and of course, they need a very authoritarian government in place to be implemented. So the consensus was that, we could never have done those policies in the West. And so the question that no one has really been able to answer, I think, and, we wrote a 500-page book to try to answer that question, but we still haven't really answered it, is how did that consensus, how was it literally overturned overnight, over the course of, literally overnight, over the course of 24 hours almost?
There are shades of lockdown. There is such a thing as a noble lockdown, where you lock down to stop something from spreading. Then there's the lockdown where you lock down to stop something from getting in, which is less noble, but could be.
But you could argue what they did in China was to stop the virus from spreading to the rest of the country.
They were trying, and indeed Bergamo as well, when, at least as far as I remember, the justification at that point is, this has happened here, we're not going to let it get out. So I don't understand this sort of rejection of lockdown at that level. Again, going back to the logic, locking down to prevent something from coming in can work if you're a small island in the middle of nowhere. And maybe that's something...
Works for a while.
For a while, yeah.
Like New
What's
Zealand.
really stupid is locking down to stop it from spreading. That's just stupid. And so there's...
And that's what we did.
And that's what we did.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave the formal part of the conversation there because we always stop at 8:30 as promised. But by all means, stick around. We'll be here. The bar will be open and the restaurant downstairs is open. If you're following online, this is the end of the online stream, but thank you for joining as well. May I just say, of course, we have not answered all the questions tonight, and you can see that there is a lot of disagreement even among us. But to me, at least, it's been incredibly refreshing just to be able to address these difficult issues and have an open and normal conversation about it, which is one thing we did not see in the official COVID inquiry. So please join me in thanking Thomas Fazi, UnHerd.